The first, Samadhi Pada. Patanjali's opening words are on the need for a disciplined code of conduct to educate us towards spiritual poise and peace under all circumstances. He defines yoga as the restraint of chitta, which means consciousness. The term chitta should not be understood to mean only the mind. Chitta has three components: mind or manas, intelligence or buddhi, and ego or ahamkara, which combine into one composite whole. The term self represents a person as an individual entity. Its identity is separate from mind, intelligence, and ego, depending upon the development of the individual. Self also stands for the subject, as contrasted with the object of experience. It is that out of which the primeval thought of I arises, and into which it dissolves. Self has a shape or form as I, and is infused with the illuminative or sattvic quality of nature, prakriti. In the temples of India, we see a base idol, an idol of stone that is permanently fixed. This represents the soul or Atman. There is also a bronze idol, which is considered to be the icon of the base idol, and is taken out of the temple in procession as its representative, the individual self. The bronze idol represents the self, or the individual entity, while the base idol represents the universality of the soul. Eastern thought takes one through the layers of being, outwards from the core, the soul, towards the periphery, the body, and inwards from the periphery towards the core. The purpose of this exploration is to discover, experience, and taste the nectar of the soul. The process begins with external awareness. What we experience through the organs of action, or karmendriyas, that's the arms, legs, mouth, and the organs of generation and excretion, and proceeds through the senses of perception, or jnanendriyas, that is, the ears, eyes, nose, tongue, and skin. That awareness begins to penetrate the mind, the intelligence, the ego, the consciousness, and the individual self, asmita, until it reaches the soul, atma. These sheaths may also be penetrated in reverse order. Asmita's existence at an empirical level has no absolute moral value, as it is an unsullied state. It takes its color from the level of development of the individual practitioner or sadhaka. Thus, I consciousness, in its grossest form, may manifest as pride or egoism, but in its subtlest form, it is the innermost layer of being, nearest to the Atman. Ahamkara or ego, likewise, has changing qualities depending on whether it is rajasic, tamasic, or sattvic. Sattvic ahamkara usually indicates an evolved asmita. The chameleon nature of asmita is apparent when we set ourselves a challenge. The source of the challenge lies in the positive side of asmita, but the moment fear arises negatively, it inhibits our initiative. We must then issue a counter-challenge to disarm that fear. From this conflict springs creation. Asana, for example, offers a controlled battleground for the process of conflict and creation. The aim is to recreate the process of human evolution in our own internal environment. We thereby have the opportunity to observe and comprehend our own evolution to the point at which conflict is resolved and there is only oneness, as when the river meets the sea. This creative struggle is experienced in the headstand as we challenge ourselves to improve the position. Fear of falling acts to inhibit us. If we are rash, we fall. If timorous, we make no progress. But if the interplay of two forces is observed, analyzed, and controlled, we can achieve perfection. At that moment, the asmita which proposed and the asmita which opposed become one in the asana and assume a perfect form. Asmita dissolves in bliss, or Sat Chitananda, which means purity, consciousness, bliss. Ahamkara, or ego, the sense of I, is the knot that binds the consciousness and the body through the inner sense, the mind. In this way, the levels of being are connected by the mind from the soul, through the internal parts, to the external senses. The mind thus acts as a link between the objects seen and the subject, the seer. It is the unifying factor between the soul and the body which helps us to uncover layer after layer of our being until the sheath of the self, that's the Jivatman, is reached. These layers or sheaths are the anatomical, skeletal, or structural sheath, that's Annamaya Kosha, the physiological or organic sheath, that's Pranamaya Kosha, the mental or emotional sheath, that's Manomaya Kosha, the intellectual or discriminative sheath, that's the Vijnanamaya Kosha, and the pure blissful sheath, that's Anandamaya Kosha. These koshas represent the 5 elements of nature, or Prakriti: earth, water, fire, air, and ether. Mahat, cosmic consciousness, in its individual form as Chitta, is the 6th kosha, while the inner soul is the 7th kosha. In all, man has 7 sheaths, or koshas, for the development of awareness. The blissful spiritual sheath is called the causal body, or Karana Sharira, while the physiological, intellectual, and mental sheaths form the subtle body, that's Shukshma Sharira, and the anatomical sheath, the gross body, is the Karya Sharira. The yoga aspirant tries to understand the functions of all these sheaths of the soul, as well as the soul itself, and thereby begins his quest to experience the divine core of being, the Atman. The mind permeates and engulfs the entire conscious and unconscious mental process and the activities of the brain. All vital activities arise in the mind. According to Indian thought, though mind, intelligence, and ego are parts of consciousness, mind acts as the outer cover of intelligence and ego, and is considered to be the 11th sense organ. Mind is as elusive as Mercury. It senses, desires, wills, remembers, perceives, recollects, and experiences emotional sensations such as pain and pleasure, heat and cold, honor and dishonor. Mind is inhibitive as well as exhibitive. When inhibitive, it draws nearer to the core of being. When exhibitive, it manifests itself as brain in order to see and perceive the external objects with which it then identifies. It should be understood that the brain is a part of the mind. As such, it functions as the mind's instrument of action. The brain is part of the organic structure of the central nervous system that is enclosed in the cranium. It makes mental activity possible. It controls and coordinates mental and physical activities. When the brain is trained to be consciously quiet, the cognitive faculty comes into its own, making possible, through the intelligence, apprehension of the mind's various facets. Clarity of intelligence lifts the veil of obscurity and encourages quiet receptivity in the ego as well as in the consciousness, diffusing their energies evenly throughout the physical, physiological, mental, intellectual, and spiritual sheaths of the soul. What is soul? God, Paramatman, or Purusha Vishyan, is known as the universal soul, the seed of all. The individual soul, Jivatman or Purusha, is the seed of the individual self. The soul is therefore distinct from the self. Soul is formless, while self assumes form. The soul is an entity separate from the body and free from the self. The soul is the very essence of the core of one's being. Like mind, the soul has no actual location in the body. It is latent and exists everywhere. The moment the soul is brought to awareness of itself, it is felt anywhere and everywhere. Unlike the self, the soul is free from the influence of nature and is thus universal. The self is the seed of all functions and actions, and the source of spiritual evolution through knowledge. It can also, through worldly desires, be the seed of spiritual destruction. The soul perceives spiritual reality and is known as the seer. As a well-nurtured seed causes a tree to grow and to blossom with flowers and fruits, so the soul is the seed of man's evolution. From this source, Asmita sprouts as the individual self. From this sprout springs consciousness, Chitta. From consciousness springs ego, intelligence, mind, and the senses of perception and organs of action. Though the soul is free from influence, its sheaths come in contact with the objects of the world, which leaves imprints on them through the intelligence of the brain and the mind. The discriminative faculty of brain and mind screens these imprints, discarding or retaining them. If discriminative power is lacking, then these imprints, like quivering leaves, create fluctuations in words, thoughts, and deeds, and restlessness in self. These endless cycles of fluctuation are known as vrittis, changes, movements, functions, operations or conditions of action or conduct in the consciousness. Vrittis are thought waves, part of the brain, mind, and consciousness, as waves are part of the sea. Thought is a mental vibration based on past experiences. It is a product of inner mental activity, a process of thinking. This process consciously applies the intellect to analyze thoughts arising from the seat of the mental body through the remembrance of past experiences. Thoughts create disturbances. By analyzing them, one develops discriminative power and gains serenity. When consciousness is in a serene state, its interior components, intelligence, ego, mind, and the feeling of I, also experience tranquility. At that point, there is no room for thought waves to arise, either in the mind or in the consciousness. Stillness and silence are experienced. Poise and peace set in, and one becomes cultured. One's thoughts, words, and deeds develop purity and begin to flow in a divine stream. Study of consciousness. Before describing the principles of yoga, Patanjali speaks of consciousness and the restraint of its movements. The verb chit means to perceive, to notice, to know, to understand, to long for, to desire, and to remind. As a noun, chit means thought, emotion, intellect, feeling, disposition, vision, heart, soul, Brahman. Chinta means disturbed or anxious thoughts, and chintana means deliberate thinking. Both are facets of chitta. As they must be restrained through the discipline of yoga, yoga is defined as chittavritti nirodha. A perfectly subdued and pure chitta is divine and at one with the soul. Chitta is the individual counterpart of Mahat, the universal consciousness. It is the seat of the intelligence that sprouts from consciousness, antakarana, the organ of virtue and religious knowledge. If the soul is the seed of conscience, conscience is the source of consciousness, intelligence, and mind. The thinking processes of consciousness embody mind, intelligence, and ego. The mind has the power to imagine, think, attend to, aim, feel, and will. The mind's continual swaying affects its inner sheaths, intelligence, ego, consciousness, and the self. Mind is mercurial by nature, elusive and hard to grasp. However, it is the one organ which reflects both the external and internal worlds. Though it has the faculty of seeing things within and without, its more natural tendency is to evolve itself with objects of the visible rather than the inner world. In collaboration with the senses, mind perceives things for the individual to see, observe, feel, and experience. These experiences may be painful, painless, or pleasurable. Through their influence, impulsiveness and other tendencies or moods creep into the mind, making it a storehouse of imprints or samskaras, and desires or vasanas, which create excitement and emotional impressions. If these are favorable, they create good imprints. If unfavorable, they cause repugnance. These imprints generate the fluctuations, modifications, and modulations of consciousness. If the mind is not disciplined and purified, it becomes involved with the objects experienced, creating sorrow and unhappiness. Patanjali begins the treatise on yoga by explaining the functioning of the mind so that we may learn to discipline it, and intelligence, ego and consciousness may be restrained, subdued, and diffused, then drawn toward the core of our being and absorbed in the soul. This is yoga. Patanjali explains that painful and painless imprints are gathered by 5 means: pramana, or direct perception, which is knowledge that arises from correct thought or right conception and is perpetual and true; viparyaya, or misperception and misconception leading to contrary knowledge; vikalpa, or imagination or fancy; nidra, or sleep; and smriti, or memory. These are the fields in which the mind operates, and through which experience is gathered and stored. Direct perception is derived from one's own experience, through inference, or from the perusal of sacred books or the works of authoritative masters. To be true and distinct, it should be real and self-evident. Its correctness should be verified by reasoned doubt, logic, and reflection. Finally, it should be found to correspond to spiritual doctrines and precepts, and sacred revealed truth. Contrary knowledge leads to false conceptions. Imagination remains at verbal or visual levels, and may consist of ideas without a factual basis. When ideas are proved as facts, they become real perception. Sleep is a state of inactivity in which the organs of action, senses of perception, mind and intelligence remain inactive. Memory is the faculty of retaining and reviving past impressions and experiences of correct perception, misperception, misconception, and even of sleep. These 5 means by which imprints are gathered shape moods and modes of behavior, making or marring the individual's intellect, cultural and spiritual evolution. Culture of consciousness. The culture of consciousness entails cultivation, observation, and progressive refinement of consciousness by means of yogic disciplines. After explaining the causes of fluctuations in consciousness, Patanjali shows how to overcome them by means of practice, abhyasa, and detachment or renunciation, vairagya. If the student is perplexed to find detachment and renunciation linked to practice so early in the Yoga Sutras, let him consider their symbolic relationship in this way. The text begins with Atta Yoganushasanam. Anushasanam stands for the practice of a disciplined code of yogic conduct, the observance of instructions for ethical action handed down by lineage and tradition. Ethical principles translated from methodology into deeds constitute practice. Now, read the word renunciation in the context of Sutra 1.4. At other times, the seer identifies with the fluctuating consciousness. Clearly, the fluctuating mind lures the seer outward towards pastures of pleasure and valleys of pain, where enticement inevitably gives rise to attachment. When mind starts to drag the seer, as if by a stout rope, from the seat of being toward the gratification of appetite, only renunciation can intervene and save the sadhaka by cutting the rope. So we see from Sutras 1.1 and 1.4 the interdependence from the very beginning of practice and renunciation, without which practice will not bear fruit. Abhyasa is a dedicated, unswerving, constant and vigilant search into a chosen subject, pursued against all odds in the face of repeated failures for indefinitely long periods of time. Vairagya is the cultivation of freedom from passion, abstination from worldly desires and appetites, and discrimination between the real and unreal. It is the act of giving up all sensuous delights. Abhyasa builds confidence and refinement in the process of culturing the consciousness, whereas Vairagya is the elimination of whatever hinders progress and refinement. Proficiency in Vairagya develops the ability to free oneself from the fruits of action. Patanjali speaks of attachment, non-attachment, and detachment. Detachment may be likened to the attitude of a doctor toward his patient. He treats the patient with the greatest care, skill, and sense of responsibility, but does not become emotionally involved with him so as not to lose his faculty of reasoning and professional judgment. A bird cannot fly with one wing. In the same way, we need the two wings of practice and renunciation to soar up to the zenith of soul realization. Practice implies a certain methodology involving effort. It has to be followed uninterruptedly for a long time with firm resolve, application, attention, and devotion to create a stable foundation for training the mind, intelligence, ego, and consciousness. Renunciation is a discriminative discernment. It is the act of learning to be free from craving, both for worldly pleasures and for heavenly eminence. It involves training the mind and consciousness to be unmoved by desire and passion. One must learn to renounce objects and ideas which disturb and hinder one's daily yogic practices. Then one has to cultivate non-attachment to the fruits of one's labors. If Abhyasa and Vairagya are assiduously observed, restraint of the mind becomes possible much more quickly. Then one may explore what is beyond the mind and taste the nectar of immortality or soul realization. Temptations neither daunt nor haunt one who has this intensity of heart in practice and renunciation. If practice is slowed down, then the search for soul realization becomes clogged and bound in the wheel of time. Why practice and renunciation are essential. Avidya, meaning ignorance, is the mother of vacillation and affliction. Patanjali explains how one may gain knowledge by direct and correct perception, inference and testimony, and that correct understanding comes when trial and error ends. Here both practice and renunciation play an important role in gaining spiritual knowledge. Attachment is a relationship between man and matter, and may be inherited or acquired. Non-attachment is the deliberate process of withdrawing away from attachment and personal affliction, in which neither binding oneself to duty nor cutting oneself off from it, one gladly helps all, near or far, friend or foe. Non-attachment does not mean drawing inwards and shutting oneself off, but involves carrying out one's responsibilities without incurring obligation or inviting expectation. It is between attachment and detachment, a step toward detachment, and the sadhaka needs to cultivate it before thinking of renunciation. Detachment brings discernment, seeing each and everything or being as it is in its purity, without bias or self-interest. It is a means to understand nature and its potencies. Once nature's purposes are grasped, one must learn to detach oneself from them to achieve an absolute independent state of existence wherein the soul radiates its own light. Mind, intelligence and ego revolving in the wheel of desire, or kama, anger, krodha, greed, lobha, infatuation, moha, pride, mada, and malice, matsarya, tie the sadhaka to their imprints. He finds it exceedingly difficult to come out of the turmoil and to differentiate between the mind and the soul. Practice of yoga and renunciation of sensual desires takes one towards spiritual attainment. Practice demands 4 qualities from the aspirant: dedication, zeal, uninterrupted awareness, and long duration. Renunciation also demands 4 qualities: disengaging the senses from action, avoiding desire, stilling the mind, and freeing oneself from cravings. Practitioners are also of 4 levels: mild, medium, keen, and intense. They are categorized into 4 stages: beginners who understand the inner functions of the body, those who can connect the intelligence to all parts of the body, and those whose body, mind, and soul have become one. Effects of practice and renunciation. Intensity of practice and renunciation transforms the uncultured, scattered consciousness, citta, into a cultured consciousness, able to focus on the 4 states of awareness. The seeker develops philosophical curiosity, begins to analyze with sensitivity, and learns to grasp the ideas and purposes of material objects in the right perspective, that is, vitarka. Then he meditates on them to know and understand fully the subtle aspects of matter, that's vikara. Thereafter he moves on to experience spiritual elation, or the pure bliss, ananda, of meditation, and finally sights the self. These 4 types of awareness are collectively termed sampragnata samadhi or sampragnata samapatti. Samapatti is thought transformation or contemplation, the act of coming face to face with oneself. From these 4 states of awareness, the seeker moves to a new state, an alert but passive state of quietness known as manolaya. Patanjali cautions the sadhaka not to be caught in this state, which is a crossroads on the spiritual path, but to intensify his sadhana to experience a still higher state known as nirbija samadhi or dharma megha samadhi. The sadhaka may not know which road to follow beyond manolaya, and could be stuck there forever in a spiritual desert. In this quiet state of void, the hidden tendencies remain inactive but latent. They surface and become active the moment the alert passive state disappears. This state should therefore not be mistaken for the highest goal in yoga. This resting state is a great achievement in the path of evolution, but it remains a state of suspension in the spiritual field. One loses body consciousness and is undisturbed by nature, which signifies conquest of matter. If the seeker is prudent, he realizes that this is not the aim and end, but only the beginning of success in yoga. Accordingly, he further intensifies his effort, that is, upaya pratyaya, with faith and vigor, and uses his previous experience as a guide to proceed from the state of void or loneliness towards the non-void state of aloneness or fullness, where freedom is absolute. If the sadhaka's intensity of practice is great, the goal is closer. If he slackens his efforts, the goal recedes in proportion to his lack of willpower and intensity. Universal Soul or God, Ishvara, Purusha, Vishedan or Paramatman. There are many ways to begin the practice of yoga. First and foremost, Patanjali outlines the method of surrender of oneself to God, Ishvara. This involves detachment from the world and attachment to God, and is possible only for those few who are born as adepts. Patanjali defines God as the Supreme Being, totally free from afflictions and the fruits of action. In him abides the matchless seed of all knowledge. He is first and foremost among all masters and teachers, unconditioned by time, place, and circumstances. His symbol is the syllable Aum. This sound is divine. It stands in praise of divine fulfillment. Aum is the universal sound, the Shabda Brahman. Philosophically, it is regarded as the seed of all words. No word can be uttered without the symbolic sound of these three letters, A, U, and M. The sound begins with the letter A, causing the mouth to open. So the beginning is A. To speak, it is necessary to roll the tongue and move the lips. This is symbolized by the letter U. The ending of the sound is the closing of the lips, symbolized by the letter M. Aum represents communion with God, the soul, and with the universe. Aum is known as pranava, or exalted praise of God. God is worshipped by repeating or chanting Aum, because sound vibration is the subtlest and highest expression of nature. Mahat belongs to this level. Even our innermost unspoken thoughts create waves of sound vibration. So Aum represents the elemental movement of sound, which is the foremost form of energy. Aum is therefore held to be the primordial way of worshipping God. At this exalted level of phenomenal evolution, fragmentation has not yet taken place. Aum offers complete praise, neither partial nor divided. None can be higher. Such prayer begets purity of mind in the sadhaka and helps him to reach the goal of yoga. Aum, repeated with feeling and awareness of its meaning, overcomes obstacles to self-realization. The obstacles. The obstacles to healthy life and self-realization are disease, indolence of body or mind, doubt or skepticism, carelessness, laziness, failing to avoid desires and their gratification, delusion and missing the point, not being able to concentrate on what is undertaken and to gain ground, and inability to maintain concentration and steadiness in practice once attained. They are further aggravated through sorrows, anxiety or frustration, unsteadiness of the body, and labored or irregular breathing. Ways of surmounting the obstacles and reaching the goal. The remedies which minimize or eradicate these obstacles are adherence to single-minded effort in sadhana, friendliness and goodwill towards all creatures, compassion, joy, indifference and non-attachment to both pleasure and pain, virtue and vice. These diffuse the mind evenly within and without and make it serene. Patanjali also suggests the following methods to be adopted by various types of practitioners to diminish the fluctuations of the mind. Retaining the breath after each exhalation. The study of inhalation teaches how the self gradually becomes attached to the body. The study of exhalation teaches non-attachment as the self recedes from the contact of the body. Retention after exhalation educates one toward detachment. Involving oneself in an interesting topic or object, contemplating a luminous, effulgent, and sorrowless light. Treading the path followed by noble personalities. Studying the nature of wakefulness, dream, and sleep states, and maintaining a single state of awareness in all three. Meditating on an object which is all-absorbing and conducive to a serene state of mind. Effects of practice. Any of these methods can be practiced on its own. If all are practiced together, the mind will diffuse evenly throughout the body, its abode, like the wind which moves and spreads in space. When they are judiciously, meticulously, and religiously practiced, passions are controlled and single-mindedness develops. The sadhaka becomes highly sensitive, as flawless and transparent as crystal. He realizes that the seer, the seeker, and the instrument used to see or seek are nothing but himself, and he resolves all divisions within himself. This clarity brings about harmony between his words and their meanings, and a new light of wisdom dawns. His memory of experiences steadies his mind, and this leads both memory and mind to dissolve in the cosmic intelligence. This is one type of samadhi known as sabija samadhi, with seed or support. From this state, the sadhaka intensifies his sadhana to gain unalloyed wisdom, bliss, and poise. This unalloyed wisdom is independent of anything heard, read, or learned. The sadhaka does not allow himself to be halted in his progress, but seeks to experience a further state of being, the amanaskattva state. If Manolaya is a passive, almost negative, quiet state, amanaskattva is positive, active state, directly concerned with the inner being, without the influence of the mind. In this state, the sadhaka is perfectly detached from external things. Complete renunciation has taken place, and he lives in harmony with his inner being, allowing the seer to shine brightly in his own pristine glory. This is true samadhi, seedless or Nirbija Samadhi,